My screen is very tiny because it gets narrowed in this process of being able to use this projector. Anyway, he's sitting here. He may not sit here all the time. He's looking over there. He's facing this way for the camera, if you will. And these are a little later in time, but these are, again, these are women that, young women who are grinding corn. The Hopi people are a very unusual population. They live this way till today. They're deeply religious. Deeply religious. They have elaborate religious traditions all about corn. They live in the high desert of Arizona, very high levels, where there's practically no way you can survive. But they've eked out a survival process where they have actually evolved a food tradition, and they are the longest living occupants of the same place, Old Arabi as it's called, in the United States. So they long before, a little more than 1,000 years ago, in the same community they still live in. Think about that for a city that's maintained in the high desert with no water and no anything, if you will. So how did they do this? They did this because, in some respects, there was no competition. No one else would ever want to live there because it was so dry and so barren, and therefore they didn't have to fight off anybody else until contemporary times, and now the Navajo have moved in and their areas have become much smaller because of legal complications. But nevertheless, the point is that they lived in peace and they lived in isolation. And in that process, they have a myth, an origin myth. The origin myth is as follows. They say that all the other Indian tribes had different kinds of corn, and they were left with a very specific corn, a small ear of what they call blue corn. Blue. If you looked at this corn, it would not be blue. It's the same color as this, or even blacker than this device. The point I'm making is that the corn is at best steel blue, if you will, navy, more than navy blue, if you know what I mean, very, very dark. And it doesn't turn blue, even when you prepare it for cooking. It only turns blue at a particular point in time. It turns blue, it turns out, when you add the right amount of what they call now, this is following my research with them. They've changed the story. You'll see the story. I've got a small video of the story, their origins, etc. The important point is that it changes blue color when it reaches the exact correct pH. That is the amount of acid and alkali that's present. The pH is slightly alkaline, and that pH is perfectly adapted to making the niacin, which is indigestibly bound in corn. So corn has this deep problem connected to it. And the deep problem connected to corn is that there is niacin there, but unless you cook it with an alkali, you cannot get the niacin out. So you can't digest it. You can't chew it, you can't swallow it, you can't boil it, etc. It doesn't come out until you've, chemically, until you touch it with an alkali. That's a really important distinction. You will see how important that was because that led to a huge amount of research that I've done. So what they did to solve the problem is they did two things. Everybody else hits it with an alkali and hits it hard. So if you were in Mesoamerica where corn became the basis of the civilization, then what you did is you treated the corn with a huge amount of alkali that you usually got from limestone. So if you burn limestone, you can actually make alkali from that. And that powder, you add that to the water, that you're cooking water, you boil the corn in that, and guess what happens? The conversion is complete. But what you do is you lose lots of nutrients that you can't digest because they're in the supernatant of the water, in the boiling water. They're in the boiling water and you have to wash off all this alkali or it'll kill you to try and eat that corn the way it is. So you must get rid of the alkali that's present. And when you wash it off, they have plenty of running water, so they don't have the problem that the Hopi has with practically no water. But they have, in the rest of these populations, And what they do is get rid of it quickly, and when you get rid of that water, the cooking water has a lot of nutrients in it. If you're the people of the high desert, like the Hopi, you do not have a choice of getting rid of the water. If you get rid of the water, if you have washing water, you're losing a lot of your nutrients. You can't afford that because every morsel counts. So if you look at these ladies grinding the corn, look at the fences around them, look at the trays, the way they're working. Those trays are designed, in essence, or evolved to keep every little morsel of dust. They have all kinds of little brushes they use to keep it in place, etc., etc. So this is really important. Every morsel counts. And a woman becomes attractive to this guy and to the males by the way she's grinding the corn. So she moves her body a little bit, and, et cetera, as she grinds the corn. So the guys look in over the women. The women then produce this final food, and that final food is called piki. And piki is the measure of a woman's capacity to produce food. I've worked with Inuit people, Eskimo people, up in northern Alaska and northern Canada. And their judgment of a woman's capacity to be a good wife is her ability to chew the sinew to make clothing, because clothing is the necessary ingredient for survival. The necessary ingredient for survival amongst the Hopi is to get a piki to be exactly correct, to get the nutrient value out of it. Otherwise, survival is not possible. Survival is not possible. So there's tremendous selective advantage in this. Think about that and how that creeps into and supported by and evolves the religion of the population. So these are key issues that I wanted to introduce to start with, because this is where the real action is here. A second point that I'm going to make now, I suppose, a little later on. The second point I want to make is that I'm trying to think of, I'm going to give you an example too. Second point is that we have capacity to detect a lot of things in our diets. I have a fantastic capacity to detect sweet in anything. I love sweet things growing up, I was really into these things, so I would have gone on pastry tours if I could have, but I didn't do very often. But I like to go and sample all these things. Anyway, but my ability to do that was my taste capacity. So we have that capacity built in, and I have the exact opposite. My wife Pauline would tell you, I'm sure, that we eat a lot of vegetables in our house, but I don't like bitter ones. I reject them all the time. My sensitivity for bitter is very high. Some people are very low. Some people like, I'm thinking of the drink, the alcoholic drink that has the bitter in it, which is a total turnoff to me, if you will. So it gives you some idea. So we have the chemical senses and the taste. We have the aromatic senses, very elaborate. And there's plenty of evidence that human evolution has there are a lot of genomic changes that are involving our sense of smell. And it's very complicated. In fact, our sense of smell is very, very acute with respect to food. So we can detect the slightest aroma of something off, and that's it. Don't even touch that. I don't like the smell of that. I can remember the Chinese people did not use dairy at all when I first arrived in China. And the joke was, amongst the Chinese people that were in China at the time, this is in mainland China, that you could smell me coming down the street, across the street, because I had had milk or something, dairy in my diet. And you could smell this a mile away, so to speak, as a joke. Well, they're actually changed now. They're now trying to eat milk at a great cost, in my opinion, because of the metabolic problems that everybody raised their hands about. But the point is clear that there are shifts going on. So people can detect the aromas and accept or reject based upon what it smells like. So we have that capacity. We have another capacity. And the next capacity is the one I was trying to think of as an example. How many people here have gone out to a restaurant or any place and had gotten really sick from the food? How many's had food sickness? How many? Take a look. Again, lots of hands. How many people of those who raised their hands can remember the details of their food sickness? Look at everybody get rid of the same group, raises their hands again. The point is that our memory of a bad episode is permanently etched in our capacity for memories. So Marcel Proust wasn't just reading the tea leaves, he was reading into something that was fundamental to what humans are all about, which is we have that vagal response that leads to sickness, if you're vomiting and sickness, is a response that we never forget. And we build that into our ability. On the other hand, if the response is below the stomach, in the GI system, below the intestines and into the large intestine, we don't learn the message. We get sick and we continue to eat that food every day and try to figure out why we're sick. In essence, in other words, we have the capacity changes as we become from more proximal to more distal in terms of the cause and effect relationships between what we eat and what it does to us. Now take niacin. Niacin, the deficiency that it produced in this corn that's bound and changed by the process that these women are going to be using to extract the necessary nutrient, that niacin deficiency is a disease that we have identified, and it changed American history when it occurred. I did an analysis of this at Google in words. There are a very interesting graph I just made of this. There's a new database of occurrence of words in books. And you can show categorically that the word pellagra, which was the disease that was present, and everybody thought in the early 1900s that was widely prevalent in the United States, that it was an infectious disease because that was the model we had. Infectious disease must be producing this. Well, the fact of the matter is that it was not an infectious disease. It was a deficiency of niacin. And no one knew this because everybody was eating corn, particularly in the southern part of the United States, and it was producing an enormous disadvantage. And a guy named Goldberger discovered this, and in the early 20s he wrote it up, and people would not believe what he wrote. Scientifically, he had the evidence, but people wouldn't believe the evidence for another 15 to 20 years. Some people believed it, but lots continued to eat the corn, and lots continued to have pellagra just the way they had it before. And it wasn't until the Second World War that it all got cleared up, and that's what led to the vitamin addition to foods in the United States. So that's when the FDA required it to be added to things like white bread. So Wonder Bread was Wonder because it produced, it had other B vitamins in it too, but niacin was the primary, if you will, mover of this. And then vitamin D, of course, in milk, etc. So it led to all these changes. But think about how long a period of time this was. We did not discover it in the West with our traditions until the lifetimes of some of the older people in this room. Think about that. Think about that. I can remember Wonder Bread as a child. I can remember it very clearly. That was a really important development at the point. And now we sort of scoff at the white bread, if you will. But the point is it was a major revolutionary change in human diets in the United States and in elsewhere. So what do we have? We had a very unusual thing occurred. The very unusual thing is that these people, the Hopi, and all the Mesoamericans, had actually evolved the technologies to extract the alkali. But the fact of the matter is that when Columbus first contacted them in 1492 and 93, said that they brought corn back, and corn was immediately used as a crop because that was this amazing crop that they were growing here in the Western world that might be useful back in Europe. And they grew it, but they never took the recipe. Recipes were something that women did. That wasn't something that men were concerned with growing food, feeding the family, if you will. But point is that the recipe never got transferred and never evolved on its own. So it means that the distance, so it isn't like my ability to smell or taste or get sick from the food. The ability to get sick from a vitamin deficiency takes weeks to develop, or months. The 4 Ds, and diarrhea, dementia, dermatitis, and death are the outcomes of a pellagra deficiency. So it's a very serious disease. But the knowledge, the evolution of that knowledge wasn't there It doesn't happen easily because there's a distance between the cause and effect relationship that we can detect at one level versus the other level. And that cause and effect, therefore, had to evolve in a different way. And I would argue it does not evolve directly from the scientific knowledge that we now have of the cause and effect relationship. It evolves indirectly in an evolutionary way within a culture, and it gets embedded in the cultural tradition. So it's a survival thing, in a sense, and it gets reinforced. And when you think about the Hopi reinforcing something, a young woman now that I started to talk about, she's going to prepare this whole, we're going to see the preparation of piki in a moment. The preparation of that bread that has all the necessary ingredients for survival in that high desert region where the ecosystem can't support you or shouldn't be supporting you, literally is brought out with piki. And piki becomes the key. So a young woman, one of the traditions is that a young woman in Hopi land, the woman proposes to the man. How do you like that? So you guys can just sit there and wait for your proposals to come in. But what does the proposal look like? The proposal is a little pile of piki bread that she leaves at your doorstep. Okay? So if you say, hey, have you been looking, as this guy has been doing in the corner of this picture, if you were looking over all these young women and say, she gave me that, I don't even want a piki bread from her. You know? So you reject it. There's something you don't like about her. She didn't do her hair right, you know, whatever it is, I don't know. But the body, she wasn't cute enough for me. Okay, let's put it that way in the context of my talk. My point to you is clear, that she proposes to me now, and I got my blue shirt on, so I'm really into piki. And blue becomes the key symbolic color of the whole society. From this is their part of their origin myth of themselves. And they maintain this. So on their website, they say they divert from scientific explanations to say that they know how they originated because this is their sense of who they are. Just as every religious group knows how they originated and has their own sense of who they are. And that identity is crystal clear right to this day. So in their case, now going back to the piki on my doorstep, so now, hey, I like her, she's really nice. I'm going to take in the piki bread and I'm going to eat it. And guess what? I like it. That's good. And she's very happy because now I say, well, I've accepted you as a potential bride. Okay? But my mother says to me, wait a minute, who made the piki bread? Did she really make this piki bread? And I said, I don't know. Maybe she made the bread, maybe she didn't. I don't know. Well, what I do, if I'm the mother-in-law, now I'm the mother-in-law, her mother, future mother-in-law, or my mother, says to her, come on, you can come and visit us and spend 2 weeks making piki bread in my house so I can see whether you are suitable enough for my son. And if you're not, go back, go back and learn how to make piki because you're not good enough to marry my son. Talk about evolutionary selection. Talk about evolutionary selection. Talk about this. And now, what is the meaning of all this? Let's go further. If I can. Okay, so I've been doing, scientifically, let me just say what I did. There are two things. First off, in this stage 1 up here, or let's go in the low one, I'm testing hypotheses about, in the scientific sense, I'm testing hypotheses about the evolution of human diet. There's biochemistry, pharmacology, the nutritional sciences, etc. So this is where I start my research. I'm a scientist, I come into this looking at it scientifically and saying, there's some nutrient deficiency or there's something else that's really interesting about this. And I'll tell you what I've discovered right now. I've discovered, it turns out, that these factors operate in every single major food that we eat. All of the dietary constituents, all of them, you hear this, all of the ones that we've evolved through agriculture have all kinds of nutritional limitations in them. All kinds. And if we don't know what those limitations are, we can't possibly survive off of this. And guess what? We did not know what they were. And way before science came along, they had to evolve. It was an evolutionary process, and I'm trying to understand that evolutionary process, and I'm giving you the evolution of this in the peaky bread today as an exemplar of how it works. So we know that an alkali breaks a bond, a chemical bond, a non-acetin bond. Corn is really the most productive crop in the world, in a sense. It really is an incredibly productive crop, and its capacity for increased productivity just continues on up, as I showed you last night. We don't know if it's going to continue because, in fact, Bill McKibben talked about why it failed in the drought last summer. It failed because of the temperature got too high for the pollination to work properly. But the important point here is, from the point of view of preparing the food, so corn can be, everybody here, how many people have never eaten corn in their life? Has anybody here never eaten corn? So everybody here has eaten corn, so that's simple. 99% of the corn we eat, that we eat on the cob, is all fresh corn. This does not apply to fresh corn. It applies to when corn becomes a staple of your whole society. So when your corn gets mature and you take it off and store the cobs, in essence, you keep the corn on the cobs and then scrape it off. It's that corn that you've stored that's important. So the storage form of corn has this chemical bond in it. The chemical bond is not there in fresh corn. So if you had fresh corn, but you can't have fresh corn, the productivity of this crop is seasonal. And you have that food for the whole season. And while the season is on, you can't survive unless you know how to process it. So the non-acetin is present there. You heat the corn and maize with an alkali, and you break the chemical bond. Where do you get the alkali? You get the alkali from this square here, from the use of wood ashes, burned shells. It turns out I studied this in a population initially in Mexico with the traditional Mayan people who fled into the jungle. This is the Lacandon Mayan that I worked with, who were, when Cortez first arrived, they fled off into the jungle and never made contact until, again, with anybody outside until about the 1930s. And then they were sort of rediscovered there. So this is what I was doing. Now, did you want to take a picture of that? Go ahead. All right. But be quick, please. Okay.
So, what about hominy, which is made out from corn? Is that
it depends if it was cooked with an alkali. So the answer is some of the hominy is and some of it was not.
But it's made with lye.
Yeah, with the hominy that's made with lye, but there are recipes for hominy that's not made with lye. That's my point. Yeah. Lye is a very strong alkali. Very strong alkali. I'm going to ask questions later on, if you don't mind, unless I've screwed up on something, because we'll get away and we'll all disappear. We'll run out of time. So what I did is, many years ago now, this is an experiment that I did many years ago, looked at the whole question of whether or not a tradition ever evolved to use an alkali with corn, and looked at the degree of cultivation of populations that used and did not use alkali, the degree of consumption and cultivation. So it's two different factors we measured in that. And we went to what is called the Human Relations Area Files in anthropology, which lists all these different databases on societies. And you can actually track out all those societies, all those Indian populations in the New World that have the circles on them. All of those were alkali users. All the ones with the dots on them, including some of these living in the same areas that they were living in, did not use alkali. So the hypothesis is that the use of alkali relieved a total limiting function on the capacity to survive off of this, and therefore led to a much higher degree of consumption and production of corn, and became the basis for their civilizations. Testing the hypothesis is statistically, of course, is almost humorous, because all the zeros that are in this are where it's ecologically possible to raise corn, But they never evolved in this group, they never even used corn. But these did use, some of these did use corn, but never evolved the alkali strategy, if you will. And as you get up the ladder, as you can see, the high consumers, high consumption, it's as if you step through a window, and the window, the latch controlling the window is the use of alkali, and you move into a new world where you can depend upon corn and build a civilization on it, and have all the elaboration that occurs with civilization, including their religious traditions, which are the storehouse of the technologies when the cause and effect relationship is so distal from you that you can't possibly understand cognitively how it works. So blue corn is there. Everything is blue among the Hopi tradition, as you can see. These blues are not unusual. This is one of their classic paintings, if you will, of blue corn traditions. This is that steel blue color that I was talking about, and it doesn't turn blue until a later stage. So here is then testing the hypothesis within a particular ecosystem in Hopi. So what she does is a Hopi maker. Here's a traditional one. Here is one of the Curtis 1922 pictures showing the same tradition. And today I'll show you it in a video in a moment. So here is a Hopi, a piki maker. At that point, she is going to use this stone as a fire under the stone, the piki stone. And the stone has got a very interesting history that I'm not going to talk about today, but it's very important. It's a whole religious tradition just related to the use of the stone and all the rituals connected to the stone that you're going to cook the most important food of your life. In fact, the food that you're going to survive with for your whole life. So it's really important to understand that. In addition to that, you're making the piki, and as you can see, it's gray here, but in fact, it does turn blue when you have the right amount of alkali added to it before in the process of making the piki. So you'll see the corn churn color, and it's the color and the way the color gets integrated entirely into their culture, and the way the color becomes the key to their origin myth, that it's the key to who gets married, it's the key to who succeeds, and it's the key to every important ritual in your life. It's amazing. And it gets over-determined this way because this is the only way you can survive in that particular environment where you can live out a peaceful life and a life of hard but possible with all kinds of amazing traditions. So here we'll start. Okay, I didn't do that one right. Okay. I'm looking for oh, here it is. I was looking for that arrow to show up. Listen to this sound. Just a second. I'm going to stop for a second and just tell you one thing about that sound. That sound is taking the corn off the cob and you put it into a basket. And the corn has lots of dust and little stones on it. So before you grind it into this very fine powder that's going to be used, the flour, for making the piki, you have to get rid of the dust and stone, etc. that's on there. And what you do is you shake it in this basket and you flip it a little in the basket and you get rid of, and the stuff falls right through the basket. Today, to commemorate that at happy hour, I brought blue corn chips and I brought one of their Hopi baskets, the winnowing basket that you hear the sound of in this, as a way for you to see how this works. I don't want you to do this on the floor of the happy hour. The corn chips, the blue corn chips I have are blue. I don't know exactly how they got to be blue, honestly. They're out of a bag, 2 different brands, and you can all sample one to get a taste. Because taste, look, how do we learn things? It isn't that we learned about that restaurant that we all got sick at or whatever thing that made us sick. We learn from experience with food, and these are very powerful systems for experience. So you're going to have that opportunity to experience that if you come to the happy hour today. It's a big opportunity for you. So now, look. So the sound.
approximately 1/3 to 1/2 cup of greasewood ashes. The ash liquid mixture is strained into the cornmeal and stirred quickly into the dough, which immediately changes the color to deep blue. The chemical changes from the ash fluid activates nutritional values of the beefy. As the mixture cools, it is kneaded by hand into soft dough,
See the blue color?
working with any dry cornmeal. Careful kneading is important and should never be overlooked by a beefy maker. Cold water is added in small portions until the desired consistency is achieved. Several other preparations are made, such as cleaning and organizing the beefy room and getting a supply of properly chopped wood and kindling. In the early morning, she sets a fire under the beefy stone to start slowly heating it. She seats herself comfortably, puts things around her in easy reach, and begins. One session of beefy making takes almost a full day and yields an average of about 80 to 90 rolls of beefy. Taking a small amount of batter in the top portion of her hand, she quickly spreads a thin layer on the hot stone, beginning at the farthest top part of the stone. This step is repeated until the full surface of the stone is covered. Touch of work may be done when she senses the beefy may break apart. Beefy is an important part of Hopi life for weddings, baby naming, work, party meals, gifts, for paid back social obligations. Ceremonial and religious rituals require various forms of beefy. Depending on the intended use, beefy is folded or remains flat. For weddings, 3 or 4 sheets are folded in one large square and stacked 8 to 10 squares for presentation to the groom's family. For initiation into the religious societies, a tray full of unfolded beefy layered on top of each other is presented on behalf of the initiated child to the kiva for the ceremonial father. At the time of death, 4 sheets are folded together to make one square as part of the last meal for the final journey. For the Hopi, beefy has no beginning and no end. It has always been and it always will be. Isa beefy lomunova. Ne kapaina son kasutse beefy lomunova.
So, her father was the person I worked with when I started working with a Hopi many years ago. So, just interesting that Victoria now is doing. This would have been totally forbidden when I was there. Taking a picture of anything was totally forbidden. So, in fact, we were forbidden from even publishing the research on this. So it crept out in various ways. But if you follow what their tradition was, they wanted to maintain the quality of the. Now it's changed. There's all kinds of YouTubes of this sort of thing and everything out there. But I point this out to you because I think it's important to understand how important the religious symbolism of this is to them. And this is as important as going into the middle of a ceremony the highest ceremony in any religious tradition, and photographing it as if you were an outsider. So it was a no-no then, and now it's changed. And I just point this out to you. So there is a process, and the process of the transfer of knowledge, I also studied this as well. This is something, though, that I've seen after the fact. I saw the exact same process happen in the jungle in Mexico, which is the women teaching their daughters how to do this, how to make in this case, how to make a tortilla. But it was really the exact same process. In other words, there is a process of transfer of the knowledge from one generation to the next, and all the rituals that go with it. So I took this, went into other foods, and wheat and barley, soybeans, these are major parts of the diet, and you cannot consume these without appropriate technologies. And the technologies are not clear. In other words, they have a huge evolutionary history underlying them before you get it right, so to speak. Bread and beer. I spent a lot of time with bread and beer. Some of you may know I've done a lot of things with beer over the years, the origins of brewing, etc., and bread making. Very important. Changes huge numbers of nutritional changes. So the nutrient availability of the food is just not there to start with. In a sense, if you think about agriculture as a big commemorative coin that underlies the contemporary civilizations that we come from, the head of that is agriculture, but the flip side is cuisine. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot. And what we're doing now is assuming that we're all omnivores, we can do anything. And guess what? All those hands raised indicates we're not doing a very good job, and we don't have the internal cues, other than feeling sick from food, as to what's going on. We have it coming in, we can certainly do that, but we can mask it with all kinds of processed food flavors now that make it very attractive, and we can fool ourselves. So here, I'm not going to go through these because I'm running a little late, but this is another one. Fava beans are really important, and manioc are really important foods. Fava beans throughout the circum-Mediterranean area, all through into China, are clearly associated with consumption, clearly associated with increased resistance to malaria, and also increased rate of a very serious disease that occurs when you eat it. So it's a very tricky balance genetically, very interesting. Likewise, for the cyanate that's in manioc and other foods. Temperate beans. Temperate beans probably going to become a new revolutionary bean. They're grown in the Southwest. They hope we don't grow a lot of temperate beans because in the high altitudes they don't grow so well. But in the low altitudes, they grow very well. And there are lectins in these beans, and the lectins very clearly have some very important anti-diabetogenic effects, pharmacologically. So it's really important to know that these things are there, and that was a total part of their diet. So the Pima Indians and the so-called Papago are over now, but they were called the Papago Indians by the Spanish, and that name stuck for 500 years. And those two populations that live south of Phoenix and north of Tucson to the west, those populations have the highest rates of diabetes in the world. NIDDN, non-insulin-dependent diabetes, mellitus. They have the high rates very high rates of obesity as well. And if you look at their dietary change, it all occurred in a fell swoop right during and after the Second World War, when the men were drafted. The Navajo, those Indians and the Navajos were all involved in a number of things for the U.S. Army. The codes for the Army were Navajo codes that the U.S. Army used in the Second World War. The important point is that all the men were drafted and went to serve in the Army, and when they came, and the traditional foods were no longer grown. So they shifted to what we'll call a Western diet, got off their beans entirely, and right from then on, they immediately started to become obese and develop diabetes. And so there seems to be a strong link between these, and this is a really important development. Cholecystokinin is the clearly is connected to this. That's a hormone. That's a great, well, it's a small fragment of a major hormone called cholecystokinin. That's what it is. That's the one that causes the gallbladder to contract. The gallbladder contraction occurs as a stimulus when you eat. It gets stimulated. It turns out that hot foods stimulate cholecystokinin. What's a hot food? A hot food has got a lot of capsaicin in it. It turns out that CCK8, we have these things influence our, these are hormones that influence not just our gut to secrete or our gallbladder to empty, but it actually produces something in our brain. It turns out it's a potent stimulus of oxytocin secretion. What does oxytocin do? It produces a trusting love response. Think about eating a dinner together. Think about a ceremonial, think about the banquet that Pat is arranging right now, by the way. That's why she's not here. I know what's going on here. It's so bad. So think about the banquet. Think about the ceremony of the banquet. Think about all the aspects of the ceremonial pieces of it. What's the order of the food? How is it structured, etc.? And how does it stimulate the various systems that we have that we have not knowledge about per se? We haven't taken it apart that way, but it is inherent and evolves highly with respect to the way we do things. And think about a diet now that contains a lot of the stimulus that produces a trusting love response. Think about the Latin lovers, for example. Maybe that's a connection here. I won't begin to estimate all the possibilities of this. So I've developed what I call a lock and key hypothesis. In essence, this characterizes what agriculture is about for the Neolithic. The Neolithic is that period of time that we're in now in the evolutionary time of our species that started with the origin and domestication of plants and animals. We call that the agricultural revolution. And I'm suggesting that all the animals, the other organisms, in essence, have to climb over a wall. The wall is an evolutionary wall, and the only way everything else gets over that evolutionary wall, not everything, but 99.9% of everything, gets over, is to evolve a new pathway to, in a sense, access that particular plant's defenses. So the wall is a wall of defenses that the plants have. What we have done through the evolution of cuisine, in essence, is through our genetic capacities that have accumulated in the central nervous system and the feedback effects that they have on us biologically. What we have done is we've evolved a whole set of technologies that unlock the door so we can walk right through. And that's how we've created and subverted the whole Malthusian argument about carrying capacity. So every time somebody tells you that Malthus is right, as we were told in the 1970s by the couple from Stanford, I'm blocking his name right now. Thank you, for Paul Ehrlich and his wife. The two of them wrote an incredibly interesting book. It was highly influential in the period, talking about the population bomb. Well, the population bomb didn't explode because we were already in the Green Revolution. They just didn't know it at the time because it hadn't gotten going. But clearly, the new plants evolved. We are going to be in similar revolutions now. What we didn't have, that we've never encountered before, is a wholesale change in our entire environment that we're touching on right now. And that's where we are. So, in essence, here's the key dietary shifts in the Neolithic. We went from very high variety before this period of time, when we were hunters and gatherers, to tremendously diminished numbers of plants that we depended upon to create civilizations. Corn, rice, barley, wheat, other foods like that are the fundamental staples of societies. And around 10,000 years ago, as you can see, what we've done is that we've evolved a new technology to exploit these, but at the same time, this decrease in diversity, we've, in a sense, with culture, we've reinvented nature, because not only have we solved the problems, the nutrient deficiencies of the plants or toxicity of the plants that we're consuming, we've also created where the Egyptians created bread. They didn't have one bread, they had maybe 100 breads, literally. Certainly 50, probably 100 breads. Different kinds of breads were being made in Egypt that can be reconstructed. The point I'm making is that from the narrowing of nature, through culture, we recreated nature, the variety of food, recreated variety in our diets, because that's one of the attractive things about that. So think about that with respect to the evolution right now of what chefs are doing around the experimenting that's going on. It's enormous, really interesting. So we've transformed the food from plant variety to recipe variety. We made that substitution through these technologies: heating, freezing, fermentation, yeast and molds and bacteria, soaking, sprouting, chemical combinations with other plant foods, mashing and drying, etc. All of these factors. And we deal with them in things like our banquets here. We deal with them religiously. We make them into combinations, orders and ritual, timing and etiquette of the feasts and fasts that we use. So this is the message I am going to stop here because I think it's more important to stop. Just here, I'll just show you the slides very quickly that I would have showed you. These are really going way back in time, but I can assure you that the same revolutionary things happened then that happened later, but the need for them post-agriculture is so much greater, and the need of precision in them is so much greater, and the need for elaboration, if you will, is so much greater, because there isn't, the margin of error isn't there. You can't go out and make a substitute because it isn't a substitute any longer when you're heavily dependent upon monocrops in the ancient sense. So what I'm suggesting is that what you did is you have to have the evolution of very powerful means of preserving the knowledge, preserving the tradition that embeds the knowledge of the information necessary, and therefore there's a huge amount of evolutionary selection going on that then supports the principal system for recording and reenacting this, which is through the religious traditions. I'll end there. We'll take a questions, and then we'll have a break in just 5 minutes, and we'll do more questions. You had your hand up before, so I'm going to let you talk first. Please. Just, could you identify yourselves in line? Just talk about so everybody can hear. We can hear them on the recording.
I'm Larry Brody.
Thank you, Larry.
Two questions. One, I think I'm concerned about the inbreeding of this tribe. The other was corn you buy in cans. Is that nice and whatever?
I heard the first one. I couldn't hear it. It sounded
Someone was asked about harmony.
Oh, yeah.
About the nice.
Yes.
What about canned corn?
Oh, canned corn. Sorry. Yes, thank you. Okay, first, let's just talk about the ingredients. A very interesting thing that she didn't say, but it's present, in fact, I think it's present. I think it's present in their website, that they have clans. The clans are all secret from one another, in the same tribe. And so they marry across the clans. So if that young man wasn't of a different clan, he would not be, she would never leave him any peaky to start with. So the inbreeding is avoided that way, to some extent.
What's the population?
Well, the population size, of course, is too small. But so now they interbred, it turns out, with other Indians occasionally, when times got scarce. And they interbred with the Zuni Indians, too. So it's interesting, the Tiwa, this lady's name was Siwaktua. The Tiwa is the N-T-W-A, is the ending of her name. Well, there are lots of Tiwa people also in the Zuni. So exactly how this worked, people invent, they have a system of genealogy and of marriage rules, kinship rules, that are observed to the best possible degree. But when you run out of possible degrees, you go elsewhere. Okay, and that's the way it works in essence. Canned corn there's no niacin. The niacin, it's fresh corn, and the niacin would be there. The corn, most canned corn that is fresh has never been dried. So it's the dried corn, the storage form, where the niacin deficiency exists. Please, and then I'll circle back. Just loud and identify yourself. Sorry.
My name is Pam. Some of these foods that you said that are almost staples for us, like the wheat and the fava beans and the lima beans, and corn certainly, require such a specialized process for killing or adding the nutrients. Is that somewhere? Is that known somewhere? Is that why we have all these food allergies and we're not eating those processes?
I'm glad you raised the question. I should have answered that in my lecture, but I sort of looked at the clock and decided, well, this is where I should stop. The truth be told is that genetically, if you think about this, there's selection going on for the diet. So a good example of selection is there is a cline of genes involved in the selective effects of consuming gluten in wheat that is producing a lot of problems. And in populations where there's high consumption of gluten, there's a high genetic adaptation to that. So you get apart from that, and the gluten, there's increased sensitivity and all kinds of diseases, GI diseases that come from that. We're learning that now. Same thing for alcohol. So I have maps of the alcohol gene, the aldehyde gene that goes with that. These things are being known, and they're being, the latest work on that now indicates that as of this month, to be precise, with alcohol and this gene, that it's clearly a good indicator of susceptibility to alcoholism, as a matter of fact. So there's some very interesting things now going on. The literature's filled with things. So in a sense, think about it. We had 10,000 years of adapting to different kinds of diets. And now what we're doing, under the heading of globalization, under the heading of I would call it not omnivore, but polyvorism, in a sense, you know, the idea that globalization is supported perfectly by being an omnivore. The word omnivore caught on for another reason, because in a sense it supports you eating anything from anywhere.
Without the recipe.
Without the recipe, but also without even the genetic adaptation. The recipes give you enormous advantage, but there was genetic adaptation that goes on in some cases as well. Some things haven't got any genetic adaptation. There's no genetic adaptation, well, there may be even for niacin, because it turns out an essential amino acid, tryptophan, can be converted to niacin. So, but you need a lot of tryptophan in your diet to do that, and you need even the right genes for that. That is tied up with serotonin synthesis, etc. Most of the tryptophan is used in serotonin to keep our cells happy, if you will, or whatever, keep from being depressed. The important thing is that we do not know all the genetics involved in these things, but they are being revealed right now. And the notion of what I'm talking about, we need to pay complete attention to this. So a big argument is, here are the indigenous people of the world saying, you need to pay attention to us. We have the traditional wisdom built into the way we farm, the way we produce our food. You're coming in and telling us we're going to move to the cities and eat white bread or whatever. And we're saying we want to stay there. Guess what? I think there is a fundamental message, fundamental knowledge that will be lost if they're forced out of this through our current processes. And that's a thing that they haven't come across yet. What I'm telling you right now is something that isn't present in their arguments yet. But it is happening, and I can assure you, just as her words were that this doesn't for chemical reasons, I can tell you when I started the research that they would have vehemently denied that there was anything chemical about this. This was their tradition. Don't tell me this chemistry, you know, tell me the, you know, etc. So you get the message. There's changing happening. We need to have the traditional wisdoms built in, and I would argue that our work this week around indigenous people and around the whole idea of food sovereignty is a key theme that we need to understand. There's a question here. Oh, please identify. I know who you are.
Roger Brown. I hear the variety from the globalization, but I was struck by the fact that there was a lot of plant variety originally, and because of localized focus on corn and rice, I wonder if over time there's been a lot of loss of potential nutrients in diet with that sort of ancient, very ancient diet of many plants. They would have had a lot greater variety of nutrients. Maybe. And what does that mean?
I think that the loss of nutrients could be replaced by various combinations of diets. So a good example of tryptophan in diets, beans have a lot of tryptophan in them. So corn and beans can go very nicely together, and foods get combined in different recipes. Likewise, soybeans and rice go really well together. But soybeans in and of themselves you can't consume because they have a very potent antitrypsin factor that will make you sick as a dog, if you will, if you consume them. So you must convert them into a food that's digestible. And the way you do that is you cook them up and you precipitate the protein in them and you sift away so you get the protein is precipitated when you add a calcium salt or a magnesium salt to it. It floats to the bottom. You then carefully pour off the top, and the top has all the antitrypsin factor. And you press the stuff out of the bottom, the juice out of the bottom. The more you press on that bottom and get it into a nice consolidated form, the less you have of the antitrypsin factor that will make you sick. And what you end up with is a thing called tofu. Yes, please.
Made it for. I'm remembering Susan Mulhall 4 or 5 years ago at our conference, talking about her work with bonobos
Yes.
and how the bonobos and their compound would eat sometimes and they would eat other times on their food. But delicacy, which was always their dessert, so to speak, was cooked food. Do you remember that?
Yeah, well,
And how-
yes.
So my question has to do with other species other than horn.
Yeah, they didn't cook their food. We cooked it for them. The bonobos don't cook their own food. Yeah, because cooked food has no side effects, so to speak. It just becomes easy to digest and gives you all the energy that they would like to have very quickly. They would get it more quickly if they had more salivary amylase, but that didn't evolve. Well, it's the numbers of copies. They have the gene and they do produce amylase. They don't produce nearly as much as any one of us in the room produce. In fact, we produce so much that the way the Inca developed their whole system of government was based upon hiring or somehow hurting elderly women who were being supported by them to chew corn and spit it into a thing, and they would make alcohol out of the spit beer, in essence, and they would exchange taxes for the beer. So this is the way you would come and pay your stuff, and they would give you the beer, and the beer was made from the salivary enzyme that's in the spit of these elderly women to the corn. We need to have a break. And after the break, we're going to have a short break, I think, today, because we're going to have a video that's going to orient you to the next stage of what we do thereafter. Today, we're going to start a new stage in lunches. Maybe you're going to describe what's happening.
Well, no, I was just going to give much more pragmatic information, and maybe we can talk about what's happening at us while people are drinking their coffee.
Yes.
Just to say that to try and ease the congested flow, we have started pouring some coffees. Those that are there's a few just next to the thing that says decaffeinated. Those are the decaffeinated ones. On the other.
First is that over on the table last night, and I think it'll be available today too, did you all pick up the theme around the declaration, the Melbourne Declaration, etc.? We made a whole bunch of copies.
There's still some left.
There's still some by the door, Jane tells me. So if you haven't got one, bring it with you to lunch and use that, and everybody at the table will certainly have one of them. Or two of them, so that you can pass it around in case you didn't get yours or you left it in the room or whatever. So what we did in Melbourne in 2009 was to create a declaration similar to the concept that we're using here, except that was with interreligious dialogue, and it was totally by the people who created the conference. Myself, and Lindsay Falvey. Lindsay Falvey is a very well-known Australian agriculturalist, economist, but also a scholar of religion. And he has written a number of books on Buddhism and Christianity and is deeply committed to food issues. And so I called him and said, hey, Lindsay, would you be willing to interview to help provide a history of the statement we created from Melbourne? So that statement is in your hands, and this history that you're going to see on the screen now is there. In addition, I just wanted to tell you that I have a 3-volume encyclopedia that I was editor on. In fact, some of the people in this room, Barry Brenton was one of the associate editors of the encyclopedia. This encyclopedia will be on reserve the entire time in our room. Please do not take it out of the room. That is in the room where what's the name of the room? Gullah. Hall, where all of our IRAS activities take place, where the posters will be, etc. So if there's anything you want to look up about food, but on top of that, I have the question, very good question, can you read it? It's not going to be, well, what is that? You know, the truth of the matter is that you can, because this is designed also to have all these special, there's 1,001 stories in here about food, as well as the actual text, if you will, of it. And I'm proud to say, only representing everybody who did it, because it was a huge enterprise to do this. Hundreds of people worked on it. But we won a major award. It's in the reference quote, the equivalent of a Pulitzer Prize for this document. And the very first book ever to win the same equivalent prize in the UK, the Emerald Award. So it's a very unique enterprise, and here it is. Please, I brought copies for everybody to take a look at. There are 3 volumes. There's a huge index there. So I wanted you to be aware that that exists. And now we're going to go in
What
and
I'd like to do today is to introduce you to IRAS, the Institute of Religion and Age of Science. And I'd like to just call attention to everybody that the Jill Lindsay Family, you and I participated together in a special session that we ran for the Parliament of the World's Religions that met in Melbourne in the year 2009 in November. And for that, we decided we would do something special. Perhaps you'd like to talk about our declaration. And maybe a few words of welcome to IRAS, whatever you'd like.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Solomon. It's great to talk to you in this way. And before I start, let me say welcome to all of your participants at the IRAS gathering up at Lake George. And a special birthday wish to Dr. Ian. I understand this is an important time for the organisation and for him, so congratulations all round. I think it's a wonderful subject to introduce food with religion and science. To me, this is the 3 legs that make the stool that keeps civilization going. So thank you for that. How did we get together? Well, I remember, Sol, we met in Barcelona at first, where you had presented a session with a number of people, and I attended, and after that we spoke and agreed to form some contact, and that led to us having that session together that you organised in Melbourne. And the details of that were particularly important, I think, because they brought together elements from the scientific community about food production in the world and elements of concerns from the religious community. And together, they were put together into that declaration, which I think picks up on 2 points, many points, but 2 that are particularly important. One about the importance of smallholders who feed themselves, about 2 billion people around the world, and how they're often left out of the policies for our international assistance. And on the other hand, the fact that most food is consumed in the country where it's produced. So I think we did something important there.
Good. Well, I'm glad that you felt that way. I did too. And the idea of creating a declaration that we can engage the rest of the interreligious communities on and encourage them to adopt some new levels of understanding, I think, was part of what our goal was of creating that declaration. Are there any parts of it that you recall that you'd like to bring further attention to?
Yes, and in fact, I had the opportunity of doing some further work on this. So the things that I like to focus on are the need for national food policies in each country. We have the issue that when we assist other countries through aid, whether it's loans from the World Bank or others, or from USAID or Australian aid, then we tend to have a food policy for a poorer country with insufficient food that ends up looking like our own food policies. But both the US and Australia are major exporters of food. So the policies we have don't suit a country that's short of food. And what's needed there is the first role of government being supported by a national food security plan, so that a government in a country with insufficient food ensures that its people have sufficient food at all times. If they don't have that, you can't govern, and you end up with all the problems we see today, food riots, migration, and so forth.
Oh, that's a really important point. I couldn't agree more that that was a key part of what we tried to do. And I remember another thing that we tried to do, and I'm not sure we're going to attain it this time around, but the last time around we decided that it was such a huge meeting, there were almost 10,000 people at that meeting, we figured we'd better keep it on one page. And remember, we put it down exactly to one page. Now we're going to perhaps expand it, because some of these issues that weren't there then are there now. I mean, I can think of, I was looking over it as we were thinking about this interview, and one thought that I had was the whole, that we touched on, but we didn't hit very hard. You made the point very clear, which is food sovereignty. That is a movement that has really taken over the world right now, and I think it's a very important movement that will be helpful in the long run.
Yes, I agree. And in all of these things, there's a balance to be struck, of course, because both of our countries will keep on insisting on export of foods and providing that to other nations. So there are commercial interests that must be balanced with the sovereignty interests. And in fact, following the rules that we set for ourselves, our own country set quite moral, valid rules, but then we tend to sneak around the edges of them a little bit when it suits us commercially. So there's a need for a consistency in some of our own approaches.
So what I'm hoping, I suppose, is for this program that we're going to be involved with now is the potential that we will try and encourage the moral issues and the spiritual issues connected with those moral foundations of our societies to play an even greater role in helping people of all, wherever they are in the economic ladder, if you will, to understand how important it is that food that really comes first. Because if we do that, then many of these other problems tend to disappear. But that's something I'm sure we'll get to. Other comments that you might have that you recall historically from whatever we did?
I can remember from one of our colleagues at that World Parliament of Religion saying that what we're saying is not new. We might think it's new, but it's really just a correction of a few excesses in the last few decades. And what he pointed out was that over history and from the great religions, such as Buddhism, we have an identification of the four great essentials of human life: food, shelter, clothing, and basic medical care. And after those, then spiritual objectives can be sought. So I see that in providing food, something we know about, and concentrating on that, we're giving the opportunity for people to actually develop their wider spiritual lives in the future.
Well, that's a very wonderful note to conclude this part of our interview on. What I'd like to do is to change the subject a little bit and to say, all right, what would you do if we had the opportunity to do it again now? And we will be having that opportunity. So what advice do you have for us from your perspective, having done this already before?
Well, I think you're doing it, Sol, getting more people to understand what we're saying. It is very hard for us living in these comfortable countries, and it is comfortable, we have to admit, even if things are going backwards on the stock exchange. We live in such comfort and security that it's hard to imagine what's happening in the majority of the world. So focusing on a number of people who can understand this so that we can talk about how our aid and how our international development assistance through loans and so forth can also be supporting these ideas. So I think gathering more people, I understand you've got 100,000 or more people signing a petition. This is great. I think it's important. Also the publications, and I know you don't want to advertise a book, but my book on small farmers' secure food says that, and I think we need to be having those discussions published more widely. We've got something in a journal in India, because India is a key country in all of this, a lot of great scientists looking at food problems. So we've published something in the journals in India about this. China offers some wonderful examples about how we can actually implement new ideas that help feed a wider number of people. All of these things we need to have a wider understanding of in our own societies.
Well, that's very, very good, and I think it's a great way to end our interview. I think that we've been able to introduce it, and I thank you so much. And I'm sure if you'll send me your bibliographic suggestions, we will put them on our website and make sure that everybody sees your books. I definitely want to do that. So by all means, email that to me, and I'll be sure to put it on. But overall, I just really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart and from everybody's plate, so to speak, that we're all grateful for your willingness to come around this way and share with us. And just wishing you well in your work on world food issues in Australia and throughout the Asian world that you're participating in right now. So I just wish you well, and we'll keep you closely informed, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity, Sol. And just one last word, if I may. One of the groups of people we often forget is the women. Women are the farmers of the world, and I understand at this IRAS gathering you've finally balanced the numbers of women with the number of men, so I think this is also a great start for looking at the women farmers of the world.
Oh, thank you, and I'm sure all the women that are at our conference, and the men too, will thank you very much for reminding us of how critically important that dimension is, of course, to the success of everything we do. So thank you.
We have some other videos like this that through the week we'll sprinkle them into various conversations. Let me just, besides underlining his last comment, I would like to bring your attention to reinforce what Pat said. That in a sense, this is an evolutionary experiment that we're into today, starting at lunch. We don't know how we're going to evolve this new declaration, but it's going to be in all of our hands together to do it. And it'll be your inputs and the efforts to refine the process is a part of this, of course, as well. So we don't know exactly how it's going to work. We hope you all are taking it in various ways, and we'll grow from it, and we'll grow together from it. And what we'll do is we'll work with you to make it an exciting event. The people facilitating it are all very talented and I think very committed to the area, so I think we'll definitely have some interesting things that will emerge. On Friday morning, we'll be reporting out of these as they're occurring every day, I hope, on the Beacon and our website, things that are occurring, and on Friday morning we'll get more of a synthesis of what this is all about, so we can start to meld the what is kinds of issues that are being presented in the plenary sessions and on the workshops and in the poster sessions, the what is on those, with the what ought to be that all of you are so good with dealing on. So hopefully together we'll create an incredible outcome. But again, it's an evolutionary experiment, but we hope that it works. Pat has fun comment
Okay.
We have the other mic.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay.